So, is democracy experiencing a crisis? Well, it's certainly experiencing change, and it's certainly experiencing challenge. And you may argue that crisis is something that simply goes with democracy. Democracy is born as a form of crisis. Democracy is the crisis. And the reason for that is that within democracy there are a number of tensions and contradictions which it continually has to be resolved. I would argue that elections and democratic processes themselves are a continual process of renegotiation. It's a bit like the old cliche about a long-lasting marriage, that long-lasting marriages have lasted and survived because of continual renegotiation. They are a process. They are a work in progress. They require hard work, and that's probably true of democracy. And yet, right from the very beginning of this lesson, we looked at the way in which democracy can be seen as inevitable, the only choice, the most sensible choice, the most practical and the most successful. So on the one hand, as you sit here at the beginning of this century, these first couple of decades of this century, we're living in a world of extraordinary success in many, many ways, with extraordinary challenges in others. Never before have human beings in this world, generally in this world, I mean with all of its inequalities and poverty problems, never have human beings experienced such a level of individual, of wealth, and probably of peace. Actually, you could argue that we are going through uniquely peaceful times when compared to most other eras of human history. Anyway, so democracy has within it has to reconcile the problems of the majority, tyranny of the majority over the rights of minorities, the freedom of liberty against the necessity for cooperation and order, the essential paradox of requiring of people necessary restrictions on their freedom in order that they should therefore be free. All these things lead to a sense that probably was there from the beginning, and it certainly was there in ancient Greece. Plato was no fan of democracy. Aristotle was no fan of democracy. The intellectual elites of Athens were not particularly in favour of democracy. They all saw it as the license for the ignorant and the unwashed and the multi-headed mob monster to take over, all the way through to the American Revolution, which is no fan of democracy. The American Revolution, which I think was described as forming a republic, but has evolved into a democracy. It was never formed as a democracy. One of the least overwhelming characteristics of the American Revolution of 1787 and the writing of the Constitution was democracy. They were most concerned about democracy. The Electoral College was designed to offset the problems of the tyranny of the majority, the indirect elections for the Senate initially, and so on. So democracy was both the only source of legitimate authority, the people, and yet it was also greatly to be feared. As was, on the other hand, for the Americans, the fear of tyranny of the minority. So reconciling liberty against order, reconciling minorities against majorities, rights against collective obligations. All of these things set democracy continually against itself. It's a struggle. It's a work in progress. So we might well argue that all recent books, David Runciman's book about how democracy ends, or how democracies die, or and so on, multiple books about the problems of democracy might well reflect our latest concerns, but these in some ways are in fact the latest concerns. Michael Patillo's series on democracy and trial is 10 years old, and clearly at the moment of crisis he's particularly concerned about the kind of social disorder and questioning and the kind of unsticking of glue that looked like was happening after the great 2008 economic crisis. So economic problems, Brexit, the possibility that Greece might crash out of the European Union, might even fall back into some kind of military dictatorship. Back in 2008, 2009, 2010, and now because the Trumpian rise of populism, the challenge of China is the latest challenge to democracy, the rise of populist politics in places like Brazil and Eastern Europe. So crisis, not what crisis, but crisis, yes of course crisis would be the answer to is democracy in a state of crisis. Yes, always. That's what democracy is. Sometimes I used to ask my students in class, I would say, what would the perfect liberal democracy look like? If you were in liberal democracy heaven, what would it look like? Now this was a thing I tended to ask them at the end of courses. So you'd looked at written constitutions, you looked at codified constitutions, you looked at bills of rights, you looked at independent judiciaries, you looked at checks and balances, and you'd looked at fair and unfair voting systems, and you'd say, what would the most liberal, democratic, pluralist society look like? And if you set that as a task, and you started, well, you would have to have an entrenched constitution with clear limits on the power of government and rights for the people. It would look a bit like the American Constitution, probably. In some of its content, it would have a Bill of Rights, some fundamental rights. It might well emphasise certain positive rights, rights to education, rights to fair treatment in the law. It would have an independent judiciary. It would have an independent and representative judiciary. It might have rights for women and minorities enshrined in the Bill of Rights. It would also have a fair voting system. It might well have some ways of limiting the power of the majority, protecting the rights of minorities. We'll establish that. But it also might well have, would be very highly democratic. It would probably be a federal system. There would be local government. Well, as soon as you start to describe the most liberal democracy in history, you sort of end up with the Weimar Republic. And if you look at the history of Germany after the First World War, the constitution they wrote, largely written by liberals, with some socialist input, but largely written by liberals, it is almost the perfect constitution. It has more limits to dictatorship, more protections of minority rights, more fairness of democracy, more safety valves if democracy gets in trouble. They have tried to think their way out of possible crisis. The famous Article 48 of the Weimar Republic, that the president can assume powers of a dictator in order to protect the democracy. They saw that democracy might be a potential. There might be problems for democracy. It might be a system for good times. So in the bad times, the democracy could be defended by the president. On the other hand, it would have the rights to free speech, the rights to protest, rights of women, an extraordinarily fair voting system. Well, the Weimar Republic of 1919 didn't last. It crashed, and one of the things that took it apart was those emergency powers they'd given to the president in order to defend the system. They'd imagined that the president would be a defender of democracy, and they did never conceive they might elect a president who would not have no particular love for democracy in Hindenburg. It had a Bill of Rights, it had a most extensive Bill of Rights, it had a most entrenched constitution, but all of that was relatively quickly swept away after the economic disasters of the Wall Street crash, the worldwide global recession, and the election of the Nazis. Britain enjoys few of the protections against dictatorship, and few protections of individual and minority rights that other countries have. And certainly the Weimar Republic is a model of liberal democracy compared to the British Constitution. In a sense then, the way in which democracies survive and are in crisis may not be able to be insulated against by designing a really good democracy. Fair voting systems, bills of rights, entrenched structures, emergency powers not to be used except in emergency, and so on and so on. It may be, and this is one of those thoughts that continually revives in democracy, it may be that democracies survive partly because they survive. There's a sort of dark matter about democracies, something you can't quite explain, a sort of missing particle, the Higgs boson of democracies. That democracies that survive because of, well, what is it? Is it hundreds of years of tradition? Is it a highly educated population? Is it good luck, years of prosperity, all lining up one after another? Is it not being defeated in wars? Is it a youthful or an aged population? Which is best for democracy? Well, there's a tendency to believe that a number of these features that are necessary for democracy are themselves part of human progress, which leads you to believe that democracy is inevitable. And some of these features of democracy are quite fragile, which leads you to believe democracy can collapse quite easily. So the 1930s, the 1970s, the collapse of democracies today, in places like Burma and Myanmar, we might well say, well, there you go, democracy is uniquely fragile. But on the other hand, if societies are allowed to progress meaning develop long-lasting and stable institutions, adopt structures such as the rule of law, and accept ideas such as principles such as individual rights and economic development, then democracy comes along the way. You just, as I said in my first video, have to sort of sit back and let it happen. Democracy is a kind of inevitability, and yet highly fragile. Can democracies get old? Or rather, can they become middle-aged? This is very much the thesis put forward by David Runciman in his book, How Democracy Ends. It's really well worth reading, and you can read it, or you can get it on recorded books, or you can see lots and lots of lectures. He's given a lot of lectures on this, and if you don't listen to David Runciman's political podcast or his history of political ideas, really you're missing out. It's really, really good, and it's a wonderful book. It's much less of a dramatic prediction of the end of democracy than it is an analysis of how democracies might end if things go on the way they're going. So it's more, I kind of imagine him going to the publishers and giving it a different title. The title would be more accurate. The title would be more accurate of his book would be something like, "What got you here won't get you there." And that expression, "what got you here won't get you there," was all that aphorism, that phrase, "what got you here won't get you there," was one I used to use to students when they were coming out of year 11 into the sixth form, and you'd say, well, what got you through your GCSEs and into the sixth form is not going to get you to university. You're going to have to up your game. What got you here won't get you there is very much the idea that democracy, what made us the democracy, the strengths that produce the democracy we live in right now, won't necessarily contend with the changing world in which democracy is currently evolving into. Another way you might understand the Runciman hypothesis, the middle-aged democracy hypothesis, is to look at a poem by C.P. Cavafy, the Greek poet, who it's called "Waiting for the Barbarians." It's a wonderful poem, and it's about how the senators gather in the square in Rome, waiting. The barbarians are coming, and they put on their finest togas and they wait all day for the barbarians are arriving. And then finally, at the end of the poem, a messenger arrives and says, well, actually the barbarians aren't coming, and in fact there were never any barbarians. And the senators in the old republic, or the old empire, whoever it is in the past, look at each other and say, "That's a pity. What do we do now if the barbarians aren't coming? For they were a kind of solution." Waiting for the Barbarians by C.P. Cavafy. What are we waiting for, assembled in the forum? The barbarians are due here today. Why isn't anything going on in the Senate? Why are the senators sitting there without legislating? Because the barbarians are coming today. What's the point of senators making laws now? Once the barbarians are here, they'll do the legislating.
Why did our emperor get up so early? And why is he sitting enthroned at the city's main gate, in state, wearing the crown? Because the barbarians are coming today and the emperor's waiting to receive their leader. He's even got a scroll to give him, loaded with titles, with imposing names. Why have our 2 consuls and praetors come out today, wearing their embroidered, their scarlet togas? Why have they put on their bracelets, with so many amethysts, rings, sparkling with magnificent emeralds? Why are they carrying elegant canes, beautifully worked in silver and gold? Because the barbarians are coming today, and things like that dazzle the barbarians. Why don't our distinguished orators turn up as usual, make speeches, say what they have to say? Because the barbarians are coming today, and they're bored by rhetoric and public speaking. Why this sudden bewilderment, this confusion? How serious people's faces have become. Why are the streets and squares emptying so rapidly? Everyone going home, lost in thought. Because night has fallen, and the barbarians haven't come. And some of our men just in from the border say, there are no barbarians any longer. Now what's going to happen to us without barbarians? Those people were a kind of solution.
In this sense, David Runciman's idea was very much that democracy isn't middle-aged because it's lived many centuries. Actually, he says it's quite new. Particularly British democracy, American democracy are only a matter of a century or so old. If you say democracy starts when most people, men and women, get the vote, you could say democracy doesn't exist much beyond the beginning of the 20th century. So democracy is really a really short-lived experiment so far in modern terms, especially representative liberal democracy is quite a short-lived experiment. But it also, however, it has arrived at a sort of middle age. I mean, society has changed so fast. The demographics of our society have changed so much. The economy, the technology of our society have changed so much that it's facing a kind of atrophying old age. Rather like the senators in the square in Rome, there's a kind of loss of momentum, a decay which a crisis might have sorted. He points in the past that some of the problems of some of the ways in which society was shaken up and rejuvenated were things you wouldn't want to happen: wars, plagues, crises. Because since he wrote his book, we've had a pandemic, but I don't think that's quite the scale he was after. Although we'll have to see whether the pandemic does have a rejuvenating effect on democracy. But largely, the great wars of the past, the catastrophic shaking up of society, won't solve the problems that are facing democracy. And he paints a changed landscape since the emergence of modern representative democracy in the late 19th, early 20th century. He says those societies were youthful, the society is demographically old, a really much older society. That society was poor, this society is a rich consumer society. Largely, with the industrial society, our democracy has delivered ever-increasing living standards, even though individual periods, individual groups there have been difficult times, the banking crisis of 2008, Great Depression, but largely it's delivered ever-increasing. We've never been as old a society, and we've never been as rich a society. We've also never been as unequal a society. He points out that at various times in the past, when deep embedded inequality tended to be shaken up by wars or revolutions. He says we're now in another period of deeply embedded and very, very extreme inequality, in which power and wealth is concentrated, wealth particularly is concentrated in the hands of a tiny few. You can fill a London bus with people who have collectively more wealth than the entire continent of Africa, more than the countries of Africa. That the 5 great corporations, I'm going to say, I can't remember name that, Facebook and Google and Amazon and the others, that you can name 5 great corporations that actually have a greater have a greater productive wealth than India. Also, we live in a society of extraordinary technological change. So rapid, it's breathtaking. I can remember when I started at my school, in the last school I taught at, not my beginning of my teaching career, but the last school I taught at, there was no internet. And then when I left, internet was an essential part of learning and communicating. So technological change, inequality, ageing society, extraordinary wealth, and declining institutions that haven't changed, that have become kind of ossified in their they've been tweaked at. The House of Lords is still there, the House of Commons is still there, first past the post is still there. Political parties and participation crisis has increased in the sense that we have become politically more polarised, but fallen out of love with actually belonging to political parties. Our ideas more extreme, our information more fragmented. And so he envisions a future, David Runciman, where I guess if you imagine the sort of bleak Runciman future, it would be that democracy would sort of slowly drift into a kind of like the end of the universe, colder and colder and more sterile and more apparently going through the motions of democracy without actually achieving and delivering those things that people think it should deliver. He identifies the two main things. We should deliver welfare, deliver wealth, deliver improvements in life, and at the same time...
The great success story of the democratic century, the 20th century, was that the state delivering results to the citizens went along with the citizens feeling that they had a voice. And these things reinforced each other. And now, even if the state through this technology is going to require capacities to really track our preferences and to give us what we want in real time, it does not feel like listening to us. Often the preferences are preferences that we're not even aware that we've expressed, being tracked in ways that we don't understand by people who are not accountable to us. And even if it does deliver better outcomes, more benefits, better healthcare, better transportation, more efficiency, it will not feel like it's responsive to voice. And meanwhile, a lot of the voice is being expressed as anger against this kind of technical efficiency, suspicion of it, anger of it. And the institutions that used to bridge popular voice and the power of the administrative state, newspapers, political parties, are being broken by this. Political parties are, if anything's going to go from that story soon, it seems to me political parties are the first thing in the firing line. Now, that is not a story about the 1930s. It is not a story about the death of democracy. It is, to refer to the title of this talk, a story where democracy could simultaneously renew itself and decay.
Democracy can end because it sort of runs out of steam. Its ability to deal with change falters. It's a future of a prosperous society, but lacking energy. Barbarians would have been some kind of solution. Almost at the same time as David Runciman's book, How Democracy Ends, a book was published called How Democracies Die by Daniel Ziblatt and Stephen Levinsky. And this is altogether much more apocalyptic kind of book, and their ideas are straight up really aimed at developments in Eastern Europe, in Poland, in Hungary, developments in India, the rise of populism and the rise of Donald Trump, or the election of Donald Trump. And it is comparisons between those and immediate past history, not so immediate, but past history, the 1930s in particular, and the collapse of democracy in places like the Weimar Republic and Eastern Europe and Spain and so on. The rise of populism, coup d'etats, decline of democracy, they point out again that democracy is extraordinarily fragile, something that David Runciman recognises, that democracy is a continually renegotiated proposition, that it has within it certain contradictions that make it always open to possible catastrophic collapse. And they point to what those conditions are.
Donald Trump's election raised a question that Daniel Ziblatt, my co-author, and I never thought that we would ever ask. Could American democracy be in danger? Like most Americans, we had always taken the stability of our democracy for granted. And there were good reasons for this. No democracy as rich or as old as America's has ever broken down. And yet Trump's election seemed to place us in uncharted territory. In his classic book, The Breakdown of Democratic Regimes, the Spanish political scientist Juan Linz devised what he called a litmus test to identify authoritarians before they come to power. It seems like a useful thing. So we presented kind of a refined version of that litmus test in our book. And Donald Trump tested unambiguously positive on the test during the 2016 campaign, checked every box. He suggested that he might not abide by the results of the elections. He threatened legal action against critics in the media. He threatened to lock up his opponent, and he condoned and even encouraged violence. No major party presidential candidate in modern American history has ever behaved that way. But Daniel and I had seen politicians behave that way. Daniel in his work on interwar Europe, me in my work on Latin America. So watching the 2016 campaign unfold had both of us feeling like we'd seen this movie before, and it's a movie that does not end well. So we decided to write a book, one that tries to draw lessons from democracies, other democracies in crisis, some of which survived these crises, some of which didn't, and try to apply those lessons to the United States. So how do democracies die? Well, they don't die like they used to. Democracies used to die at the hands of men with guns. During the Cold War, 3 out of every 4 democratic breakdowns took the form of a classic military coup. The general seized power. Contemporary democracies die in more subtle ways. They die at the hands not of generals, but of elected presidents and prime ministers, leaders who use the very institutions of democracy to subvert it. So democracies die constitutionally. They die through elections, through referenda and plebiscites. They die through parliamentary legislation. They die through Supreme Court rulings. As a result, citizens aren't always aware that their country is sliding into authoritarianism, sometimes until it's too late. So in 2011, for example, 12 years into Hugo Chávez's presidency, a majority of Venezuelans, according to surveys, still believed they were living under a democracy. Same is true in Turkey, a decade into the AKP's rule. Same is true in Hungary and Poland today. So if democratic breakdown begins at the ballot box, one of the keys to protecting democracy lies in keeping extremists and demagogues from getting elected in the first place. And here political parties play a central role. Parties are democracy's gatekeepers because they're the ones who select the candidates. They have the power to keep extremists and demagogues out. It's when parties fail to play this gatekeeping role that democracy gets into trouble. Elected authoritarians very rarely make it into power on their own. Almost always they get an assist, a helping hand from mainstream political parties. Mainstream parties, particularly ones that maybe are not doing very well politically, are often tempted to strike kind of a Faustian bargain with popular demagogues. They align with them, they work with them in the hope of tapping into their popular support, but also in the belief that ultimately they can control them. But this bargain often backfires. In Italy in the 1920s, liberal leader Giovanni Giolitti, trying to tap into Mussolini's mass appeal, included the fascists on his Liberal Party candidate list. That helped to normalize Mussolini. It opened the door to his rise to power. In Weimar Germany, the leader of the German Conservative Party forged a loose alliance with Hitler as early as the 1920s, trying to draw on Hitler's grassroots appeal to shore up his party's declining base. The strategy only served to legitimize Hitler. In early 1933, when conservative leader Franz von Papen tried to ease the concerns of many of his conservative allies about Hitler's appointment as chancellor, he told his conservative allies, "Don't worry, within 2 months, we'll have pushed him so far into a corner, he will squeal." In both of these cases, mainstream party leaders, driven by short-term political ambitions, abandoned their gatekeeping role and let extremists in the door. In both cases, turned out to be tragic miscalculation. Ryan, McConnell, Rubio, Cruz all endorsed Trump. McCain withdrew his endorsement but refused to support Hillary Clinton. Bush remained silent. Republican leaders in private knew that Donald Trump was a demagogue. They're not stupid. They knew damn well he was unfit for office. There goes the graphic language. Just a point. But no major Republican leader was willing to do the one thing that would have ensured Trump's defeat, and that is endorse Hillary Clinton. Not a single prominent Republican official across the country endorsed Clinton. No governors, no senators, one Republican member of Congress, and he was retiring. That sent a powerful, crystal clear signal to Republican voters. It told Republican voters that Trump was an acceptable candidate and that this was a normal election. That turned the election, the 2016 election, into a standard two-party race. In the context of a so-so economy, middling presidential popularity, a standard two-party race in this country can go either way. And of course, it went Trump's way. So now, for the first time in more than a century, we have a sitting president with a demonstrably weak commitment to constitutional and democratic norms. That's where our institutions come into play. Americans place a lot of faith in our Constitution, in our constitutional system, and for very good reason. We have the oldest, the most successful Constitution in the world, and our system of checks and balances has, in fact, contained many powerful and ambitious presidents in the past. Andrew Jackson, Teddy Roosevelt, FDR, Nixon. Why should it not contain Trump? It might. But one of the core messages of our book is that the Constitution by itself is not enough to save us. Constitutions are never self-enacting. They don't work automatically. If they worked automatically, then Argentina, whose constitution in the 19th century was nearly an exact replica of ours, would have been a stable democracy in the 20th century. Instead, it suffered 6 military coups. Same constitution, very different outcome. Constitutions work best when they're reinforced by robust democratic norms, unwritten rules. Our book focuses on 2 of these unwritten rules in particular, 2 norms in particular. The first is what we call mutual toleration, or accepting the legitimacy of our partisan opponents. That means that no matter how much we disagree with our rivals, no matter how much we may dislike our rivals, we recognize both publicly and in private that they are loyal citizens who love the country as much as we do, and crucially have an equal, legitimate right to compete against us, and if they beat us, to govern us. In other words, we do not treat our rivals as enemies. Second norm, a little bit more complicated, is what we call institutional forbearance. Forbearance means refraining from exercising one's legal right. It is an act of self-restraint. It's an underutilization of power. We don't think about restraint and forbearance very often in politics, but it's absolutely vital. Think about what the President of the United States is constitutionally able to do. The President can pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. I'm still in denial. The President can pardon whomever she wants, whenever she wants. Any president with a majority in Congress can pack the Supreme Court. Don't like how the Supreme Court is ruling, don't like the ideological composition of the court. If you have a majority in Congress, you can pass legislation, expand it to 11, to 13, and fill it with ideological allies. Perfectly legal. If a president's agenda is stalled in Congress, he or she can circumvent the legislative process and make policy through presidential proclamations, executive orders, and other forms of decree. The Constitution does not explicitly prohibit such action. Or think about what Congress could do. The Senate could use its constitutional right of advice and consent to block every single one of the president's cabinet appointments, every single one of the president's judicial appointments. It can refuse to allow the president to fill a Supreme Court vacancy. Congress can refuse to fund the government. It can effectively shut the government down. And of course, it can impeach the president on virtually any grounds it chooses. My point here is that politicians can exploit the letter of the Constitution, even our brilliantly designed Constitution, in ways that totally eviscerate its spirit and threaten democracy. Legal scholar Mark Tushnet calls this sort of behavior constitutional hardball, using the letter of the law in ways that undermine the spirit of the law. Look at any failing or failed democracy across the world, and you'll find an abundance of constitutional hardball. Argentina under Perón, Spain and Germany in the 30s, Venezuela under Chavez, contemporary Hungary, Poland, Turkey. Constitutional hardball is how even a brilliantly designed system of checks and balances can be subverted. So why the hell is this happening? More graphic language. Our norms, we argue in the book, are being shredded by polarization. Over the last 25 years, Republicans and Democrats have come truly to fear and loathe one another. In 1960, 5% of Republicans and 4% of Democrats, according to surveys, said they would be unhappy if their kid married someone from the other party. 5%. Today, the number is 50%. According to a recent Pew survey last year, 45% of Republicans, 41% of Democrats say the other party's policies threaten the nation's well-being. That's not just opposition. 49% of Republicans and 55% of Democrats say the other party makes them afraid. We have not seen this kind of partisan fear and hatred since the end of Reconstruction. And this is not just traditional liberal conservative polarization. People do not fear and loathe one another over taxes. They don't fear and loathe one another over healthcare reform. They just don't. Today's partisan differences run deeper than that. They're about race, religion, and way of life.
Another book I would recommend is Anne Applebaum, The Twilight of Democracy, or How to Fix Democracy. She's written extensively, again, from her experience about Poland, but also looking at places like the UK and Brexit. And again, we're looking here at the rise of populism and the slow and insidious way in which democracies can be teased apart, not in the Runciman way, by big sort of social tectonic changes that democracies fail to see, but these are happening under your nose. These are the things like the control of the press, the deliberate production of fake stories, fake news, control of the media, undermining of the rule of law, in a way that is presented as nationalist populism, in a form of democracy that, you know, the leader listens to the people, but by listening to the people undermines their democratic rights.
Mine from abroad and so on, but most of them were Poles, and most of them were friends of mine and my husband. My husband was then he was a junior minister in a Polish kind of center-right government, and lots of the people who came to the party were also in politics. Some of them were journalists. And at that time, we all would have felt that we were kind of more or less on the same team.
So you could talk to one another, even if you
talked
didn't agree about everything.
We didn't agree about everything, but we were sort of all more or less whatever in favor of democracy and, you know, markets, because that's what we were in favor of, decommunization, and probably everybody in the room wanted to join the European Union, which of course happened a few years later. And I had a reflection more recently, which is that, you know, 20 years later, which is that about half the people in that room would no longer speak to the other half of the people in the room. That there's been such a profound polarization and such a deep parting of the ways. This is particularly on the Polish right, but I think something similar happened on the right in the United States and in Britain and in other countries too. As one group gradually moved away from those ideas, this is my interpretation of it, and began to see flaws and things missing in democracy, and began to long to be part of some kind of moral community, in some ways began to feel threatened by influences from the outside. These were the people who often couldn't speak foreign languages. Some of them could, though, and began to look for an alternative social model. But the article was also trying to describe how you know, what is the path from democracy to non-democracy? There are many stages in between. And we tend to have an imagination, you know, there's going to be a coup d'etat or there's going to be violence. Actually, there are a lot of ways to attack and undermine democracy that don't require any of that. And you can do it with the consent of many people. You know, lots of people really hate the media. They don't like it. They don't like people shouting on their television screens every night. Having it taken over by the government and having it start to sound a little calmer and everybody says more or less the same thing. You know, a lot of people find that to be really quite a great relief. Or the, you know, we who live in democracies have come to accept the idea that there's a lot of strife and argument in public life. And, you know, I thrive on that. I think it's great. I don't mind it at all. A lot of people find it bothering. You know, why is there so much disagreement? Why can't our politicians all agree? You know, what is this pointless, just, you know, these arguments they have in their outdated institutions?
What about the UK, the United States, Germany? How healthy is democracy in your view generally?
So the UK, I've lived there on and off for 20 years, and the real tragedy of Brexit, and there, you know, I know Europeans will feel differently, but has been the disrepute into which it has brought Parliament and Westminster. And for exactly this kind of reason, people say, because most people don't understand the details of these trade agreements they're arguing about, all they can see is that their elected politicians can't come to a solution. And they find, you know, and this is, you know, and they know people have lied to them.
So we've got 10 minutes.
Well, that interview with Anne Applebaum brings to an end this first lesson on democracy. We've looked at the democratic deficit, we've looked at the participation crisis, we've looked at definitions of liberal democracy. All of these are key elements within the A-level syllabus of government and politics, EdXL and AQA. However, the final video, the one you've just looked at, if you've got this far, is exploring the general sort of crisis of democracy, and particularly a couple of examples of the literature on the crisis of democracy, isn't explicitly identified in the A-level syllabus, but it does explain the structure of the A-level itself and many of its concerns. And certainly you'll be able to use ideas from those writers and your understanding of those writers in your understanding of the A-level politics, government politics. And the reason for that is because all the way through the A-level government politics is going to ask whether voting systems are fair, whether the Parliament works effectively, whether it's accountable, whether Congress in America has become too polarised, whether we should have a codified constitution. In other words, it's a series of questions about ways in which we can improve our political system, which implies deep concerns about whether it works effectively or maybe is indeed in a state of crisis. The next lesson will look at voting systems, voting, and the history of elections and the history of the franchise. To explore all the concerns of this first lesson, look at the Politics Shed website. There are multiple links. I will be continually updating it. Please add comments either on the comments on YouTube or on the comments on the website, suggestions of lessons I can cover in the future, or suggestions of pages that need to be improved, or if you see any inaccuracies, please let me know. My aim is to explore the entire A-level course, British and American, and ideas as well. That is the first lesson on democracy.